Hello, I'm Cairo from the Open Police Archives Committee, and I'm here today with Lloyd Simpson, who's an activist in Detroit. And we're going to talk about today is the mass incarceration system and how it affects the people of Detroit. And also, Lloyd has very personal experience with this, and we were going to talk about that a little later on as well. So, how are you doing, Lloyd?
I'm doing well today, Cairo. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me about incarceration and how it's personally impacted my family.
No problem. So, to start, I wanted to talk a bit about what is going on with the Black community in Detroit today and how has the mass incarceration system affected people there in Detroit.
Right. So mass incarceration and policing um, has had a massive impact on the city of Detroit over the previous half century or so since mass incarceration began in the country writ large. And in Detroit, we have, obviously in Detroit, which was the center of industrial capital in the 20th century, um, was hit hard by the transformations in capitalism in the 1970s. But it was also hit hard uh, by white flight, not just capital flight, right? Many central industrial cities were in the 70s and 80s, and Detroit became the blackest major city in the United States of America somewhere in the 1980s. And but policing, even as Detroit became majority black, and you had black folks in city administration roles for the very first time, appointments by Coleman Young, who was the first black mayor of the city of Detroit. Policing and incarceration continued on a racial continuum along the lines of class at the nexus, specifically at the nexus of race and class in the city of Detroit, right? And so while you had deindustrialization and white flight and eventually black flight, middle class black flight to surrounding suburbs, um, you also had mass incarceration and drug war policing, right? Which
Mhm.
removed, in conjunction with deindustrialization and white and black flight and capital flight, it removed generations of people from their communities, right? And so here's the thing. We often, in our society, in American society, and I can imagine is similar elsewhere in the Western world. But we tend to otherize those who do drugs or commit crimes, right? But then we also don't have an even system of justice, right? We have a president of the United States who's been convicted of many crimes, who's implicated in more crimes, who continues to execute people, via an illegal war he's prosecuting in West Asia, right? And he's not held responsible, right? We have $60 billion in wage theft from workers in the United States of America every year, but those people are not, the people who commit those crimes are not incarcerated, right? So the people who are incarcerated in the United States of America, 2.2 million people, more per capita than any other country in the Western world, right? It's poor people, predominantly black people, right? Predominantly people of color. But it also affects working class white people as well, right? Or hemmed up in that system. Because as I said before, policing and incarceration happens at the nexus of race and class. And so Detroit, over the course of the 80s and 90s, began to lock up more and more of its citizens for record amounts of time. The state of Michigan has some of the most draconian sentencing laws in the United States of America, and has since the 1970s. Right? We often think of Detroit and Michigan as a state, as a Midwestern state, a northern state, right? But in reality, a lot of the social dynamics in Michigan reflect social dynamics in the South, even though they might be executed in a different way, right? It's one of the most segregated states. And in the Detroit metropolitan area is very, very segregated. And so, middle class folks, both black and white, over the past 20 years, often clamored for more policing to deal with what was at its root an economic issue, right? And
Mhm.
something that they understood concretely, even back in the 70s and 80s. I'm writing a dissertation on policing and black community activism from post-war Detroit to the present. And it's something that has always been understood. So like this idea, this reformist kind of notion that, that this system can be reformed, and there's a better way to, store poor and working class people that we deem disposable. The reality is that they have always known, right? The establishment has always known that at its core, the instability of black communities in the inner city, and and so-called crime, that is all at its root a crisis of capitalism, right? It's a
Mhm.
crisis of capitalism, that we imprison people at such high rates, imprison black people exponentially at higher rates than white folks in this country. And so mass incarceration and policing has torn apart this shit. Has torn apart this city. Has has contributed to its decline, and the disempowerment, the democratic disempowerment of working class black people here.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I think Detroit, like you were saying, is like a microcosm of what happens throughout this whole country with Black people and policing and mass incarceration. And like you're saying, Detroit is like super segregated. I live in New York, and so it's like you would think it would be like more whatever. Everyone calls it a melting pot and whatever, but everyone everywhere is deeply segregated, and segregation is used to bring down the conditions for the whole working class. To use police brutality to terrorize Black people in order to keep the population in line. So thank you for that. That was very interesting. Um, so going forward, so like I said, I know you have some personal experience dealing with the prison system and how it treats inmates. I know your sister recently passed away last year, and if you wanted to describe a little bit about her and what happened to her while she was in prison.
So my sister Jennifer Jean Wallace was incarcerated at Women's Huron Valley. It's the only prison for women in the state of Michigan. And, it's a facility that is routinely overcrowded, has its dilapidated, falling apart, with mold. Actually, they've had a serious issue with mold throughout the facility that's been causing health issues. It has systemic issues of sexual assault um, by the staff. There is just routine medical neglect, right? And so my sister Jen had a heart condition. She had a mechanical heart valve implanted in 2008, and required very specific care, as any heart patient would. And she wasn't getting that care there, on a regular basis, right? And so the MDOC, the Michigan Department of Corrections, their budget is massive. It's like $2.2 billion a year annually, right? And they have, a fairly large healthcare budget specifically for, the care of the inmates at these facilities. But I don't know where that money is going. It's going in the
Yeah.
pockets of these private healthcare providers, right? Because prisons are a space where, corporations have found, in recent decades, new places to, extract wealth, and from not just from prison labor, right, which is on the rise in this country, but also from, just for charging the state for the supposed services that they're providing, right? Be that
Mm-hmm.
healthcare services or food services, right? These companies
Mm-hmm.
like Aramark providing, like, the quality of food is disgusting in there. There's they spend less than $10 a person per day to feed them, right? And it's just hell on earth, right? And so, this is there's been investigations ever since the prison opened, right? And the prison opened in the late '70s, right? And women started organizing there in the '80s, organizing immediately because of the conditions, because of the lack of resources available to them, and so it's had these issues ever since then. And shortly after my sister passed away in November, she died November 16th, just before the holiday. An officer, or a corrections officer, pled guilty to sexual assault, who had worked at that facility. So it's been a real issue there. And so, like, yeah, my sister was punished to death. She had a heart condition. She had a tooth infection that was never treated, right?
Mhm.
And so that infection spread to the rest of her body and eventually caused sepsis, right? And because of her condition, you know, for me, I've had that happen where, a tooth infection goes bad and spreads to the body. You get some antibiotics, it clears up. But she was a heart patient, right? And she was never getting that care. And so a month before she passed away, she was, roughly a month, she, fell off of her bunk in her cell and hurt herself very badly. Um, and we didn't even know about this until my mother went to visit her and saw she was in a wheelchair, right? The family wasn't contacted. And, my mom went to see her every week and, we had constant contact with her as much as we could, as much as they would allow. And, my mom noticed her condition deteriorating, over time, over the month before she went to the hospital because she didn't die in the prison. They finally took her to the hospital literally, you know, days before she passed away. She was in such bad condition. She was, delirious, sepsis. Her body had,
Mm.
she had gotten sepsis, and the infection was all around her heart. And they finally took her to Trinity Health in Ann Arbor, which is so Huron Valley is in Washtenaw County, and which ironically, it's in the same county as one of the most prestigious public universities in the nation, the University of Michigan. I'm a graduate student there. In any case, yeah. So I got a call from my mom on November 15th saying, "Hey, Jen's going in for surgery. I think everything's going to be okay." They said everything's going to be okay. I'm going to go and see her in the morning because they would not let my mom, see her before surgery, right?
Mm.
They wouldn't let her. And in fact, when she was ill, the week before she went to the hospital, my mom had to call a state representative to force the prison to allow her to come and see her. Right. And so
Wow.
she was only able to see her a week before she passed away. She was not able to see her before she went into surgery. Right. And so they called my mom, the day before they took her there and said, "Hey, your daughter's in decline. She's going into surgery. We want to let you know you should, come up here, so she's gonna be in surgery. She'll be okay." And my mom was like, "Oh my God, well, can I come and see her before the surgery?" And they wouldn't let her, right?
Mm.
And said it'll be fine, she's gonna have the surgery. And so I get that call from my mom in the morning. She's like, "I'm at the hospital. She's going into surgery. They didn't let her see her, but everything looks okay." And then she called me an hour later and said the surgery was a success. They said I could come up, right? And I'll give you a call after I see her. And, she's resting now. And then I got a call an hour after that saying, my mom crying, saying, "Jen's dead." They said, "I just got a call on my way up there, and they said she passed away." And I said, "Hold on," because then I'm just reacting at that point, and I just kind of,
Mhm.
so I rushed to the hospital and got to my mom and her oldest son before they could reach the hospital room. And we went in there and she was, there, dead in the hospital bed. And there was two corrections officers there. And we asked them to give us, a moment to mourn, and they gave us a real hard time about that. It took a while for them, and they finally did. And his family was just coming in. This all happened very quickly. So, you know, the doctor came in. That was there. That had one of the doctors. I don't think it was the doctor that performed surgery, but was there. On in the operating room to explain everything that had happened. And we asked, like, "Well, what happened?" And he was like, "Oh, well, she was in really, really bad condition when she got here, and this was very far gone." And we told her, this is she was on Coumadin. Coumadin is a blood thinner for heart patients, that they prescribe when you have a mechanical heart because they have to keep that flow going. And we explained to him that they had taken her off that medication. He's like, "Whoa, what did they put her on?" And this medication that we told, that they put her on to cut costs, because that's what these private healthcare providers do, is they're trying to, what are they're trying to profit, right? So they
Mhm.
put her on a medication. He was like, "That didn't even do anything. That's not, that didn't, was ineffective." And, and explained to us that, like, yeah, this, the lack of treatment is what led to her death. And so, I went down. So I left the room to go get my sister, one of my sisters who had not made it there yet. And when we were coming back up, the corrections officers got up and were like, "This visit is over. I got a call from the warden and we're shutting this down." After we started asking questions to the doctor about what happened, you know what I mean? They didn't, they realized that, like, oh, we're going to be responsible for this. And so they didn't even, my sister never got to see, have a moment of mourning, with my sister who passed away. They wouldn't let us back in the room. They forced us out of there. They called security, and there's like 20, 30 family members or something like that. Yeah. And so that was like how we spent the last day with her.
Yeah, I feel like you covered a lot. Yeah, and I heard this prison is, kind of notorious for its conditions, like that it's so horrible. I heard that there's some inmates in there who are growing like mold in the ears and stuff like that. So I guess what I wanted to know about everything that you said, like, what do you think the path is to make sure stuff like this does not happen anymore? Because I know like a lot of people would say like call your elected official and do stuff like that. But I feel like we've been going down this path for like so long, trying to get politicians involved and they never do anything. They always promise and promise and promise, and it's always just, a bunch of BS. So what do you think is needed to like fight for justice for your sister and fight for justice for everyone who's being currently like abused in the prison system right now? Because to my mind, I would think like involving the working class to try to take this up and fight for conditions for prisoners. But what do you think about that?
So, yeah, I mean, I would say, I think that's correct. Politicians made us promises. In February, there was a congressional hearing on the conditions at Women's Huron Valley. And, and I appreciate, I believe that Lori Pohutsky, who asked to use, my sister's cases in her presentation about the conditions there, I'm sure she's, has a good heart and whatever. And I appreciate that. Like, I appreciate her, speaking up, but also those are just words, right? And so a lot of people on that committee, on that oversight committee, had very strong words about, what happened in what was happening in that prison and, what happened to my sister and what happened to Crystal Clark, who is the woman who's still alive in there suffering with the mold growing out of her ears. They never took a biopsy of my sister's lungs, but it's almost certain, she had mold in her
Mm-hmm.
lungs, as all the women do there. So yeah, politicians, they've had an opportunity, right? And so like, the governor, Gretchen Whitmer, she's finishing out her second term and she's got her eyes set on a Democratic presidential nomination. She What has she done about the conditions, you know what I mean, in
Mm-hmm.
Women's Huron Valley? You know, uh, says that she's, an advocate and a fighter for women's rights. Well, what about the women's rights? What about the rights of the women in Huron Valley? What about the rights of my sister, Jennifer Wallace? And so here's the thing. The Democratic and the Republican Party are both deeply implicated in mass incarceration, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Republican Party and the Democratic Party literally spent the 80s and the early 90s trying to outdo each other on tough on crime policies, right? So I don't believe that, and also here's the thing, like there's a lot of people benefiting from those people, our brothers and sisters and our sons and daughters being locked up in these facilities. Private corporations are benefiting, right? And so in fact, like if you want to, who's at, who's funding the prison lobby, right? It's these corporations that stand to gain a lot by locking up working class people. So I think actually one of the things that I think that people need to understand is this idea of like, because people believe, the people in prison are dangerous and right, like, yes, and maybe somebody killed somebody. But I promise you, you know what I mean? I can point you in the direction of a politician or a CEO or a head of state that had killed some way more people. You know what I mean? Who's killed way more people and is not held responsible for it, right? Marathon poisons children in Detroit and has been for decades, right? And they are, they're not held responsible. That Rick Snyder, right, is
Mm-hmm.
responsible for deaths of little black children in Flint. but he's not going to prison, right? And so, what I think one of the things that we have to get the working class to understand is that the people that are locked up are you and me.
Mhm,
The reality is this: is that in the city of Detroit, there is no working class black person who is not touched by the policing and incarceration, or informal economies, right? That are policed, right? That exist because people are trying to survive.
mhm,
Nobody sells drugs, given the penalties you know, because they want to, like those options they are left with. Nobody gets addicted to drugs because they want to, right? It's the immiseration of of capitalism. Like my sister was, a working class woman with a family, right? She had a lot of struggles in life, not unlike Malice Green, who is, beaten to death by Detroit police, two white police officers in 1992, right? And what was, he had a drug addiction, which is why he where he was, right? But he was also an unemployed auto worker, right? An unemployed auto worker. Detroit was going through some hard times, and when people are going through hard times, it's it's not hard to turn to drugs in that despair. And like we know that also, I mean, there's plenty of research and scholarship on there that shows that these economies of vice have been sequestered in working class black communities for a century, right? um and our system so it's not about justice, right? Locking people up is not about justice. Women's Huron Valley, not about justice. Jackson State Prison, Ionia State Prison, not about justice. You're in New York, Rikers, not about justice, not about keeping people safe. It makes people less safe, right? And I think, yeah, so we need to get the working class to see that, right? We need to see that because here's the thing: the superstructure of capitalism, right? The ideology of capitalism includes, this us versus them, this otherization of the criminal. It's your own fault. If you're poor, it's your own fault.
mhm,
If you're caught up in the criminal justice system, it's your own fault, right? When in reality they're the real criminals, right? So if we're gonna lock people up, let's lock them up, right? Let's lock up capitalists, let's lock up the killers, right? Let's lock up Donald Trump, let's lock up Benjamin not Netanyahu, let's lock up those people, right? If we're gonna lock up and we really want to make people safer, right? And I think that's what we have to get the working class to understand is that the despair and the immiseration and the poverty and the violence created by capitalism is what's making us unsafe, right? And the way to really to bring safety to our communities and also rehabilitation, right? Because they try to say that prison, like this punishment, is rehabilitation, but there's no rehabilitation about it. That felony is going to follow you for the rest of your life, right? Prevent you from what? Getting gainful employment, right? To ensure that you stay in a cycle of punishment, right? And then also, like, people are not going back out. Like, people aren't hopping out of prison and being this amazing productive member of society because they have everything against them,
right.
right? And you just had them in the most inhumane institution for however long, right? um so yeah, like prisons ain't about rehabilitation. Punishment isn't the answer, and we need a revolution.
Yes, but those really good points. Um, so regarding your sister's case and other cases at uh, Women's Huron Valley, how do you think? Do you have any ways in which people can get involved if they want to help, or also like fight back against these abuses that are happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, so we're so um uh the Party for Socialism and Liberation that I'm a part of, and also Detroit Will Breathe, are joining with some organizations that have already been working on campaigns around the prison. General Defense Committee. Well, we're not, like General Defense Committee is one of the organizations that's been working on that, but also we've connected with an organization called Turning a Moment into a Movement, which is an organization that is advocating on behalf of Crystal Clark. right? And Crystal Clark is the one who's been is the woman whose condition has been rapidly deteriorating from, from the mold and lack of adequate medical care in there. Um, and other, victims organizations, for victims of prison, victims of those who are incarcerated, right? Because those are the real victims. Because so connecting with them and trying to shut this prison down, right? And shut all these prisons down, right? Because they're unjust. And if we're gonna have a new society, we got to start with the most exploited, the most um uh, you know those whom are those whom our society considers the least among us, right? The most disposable. Um, and so yeah, and obviously it's personal to me because they killed my sister. So and I try not to make politics too personal as a matter of practice. But yeah, this one's real personal. So the intention is to shut that prison down, to organize people, around the idea that a new society is possible, right? That politics can be executed. In fact, the majority of politics is not executed at the voting booth. And in fact, that's a
Mhm.
mirage, right? That we can take power, political power, in ways that are independent of that system. And I think that's what all of us are out here doing. I think that's what you're out there doing in New York. That's what we're trying to do here in Detroit is get people organized on the basis of class, get people organized around the goal of socialism, like bringing socialism to the United States and ended the bloodbath that is the United States, steeped in the blood of the formerly enslaved, steeped in the blood of indigenous people and the blood of West Asia, swimming in the blood of Gaza and Palestine, Holy Land. We need a revolution, right? We need a revolution. And I think that what is true about the US situation, right, is that black workers here and black Americans here have always been, the most simultaneously the most revolutionary and most disposable sector of the working class, right? And so the punishment comes down hardest on black folks and also, I mean, and anybody who ain't white, like ain't white or rich, like really, I mean, it's
Mhm.
bad. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's why I see, we're gonna keep doing that, keep organizing, and that's all we can do is try to bring these institutions down, bring, you know what I mean, like that's it.
All right, thank you for that. Is there any final words you would like to say? Those were pretty
I
good
just
final
want
words you just had. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I would just want to say, my sister, Jennifer Wallace, she was a beautiful person. She's a mother of six, and in fact, she was a grandmother. Um, and her story is one of many amongst the working class, uh, families that have to deal with the pain, of incarceration and criminalization. And, you know, yeah, my heart goes out to other families, other working class families that are facing these injustices.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lloyd. It was nice talking to you, and I hope you can continue fighting for justice for your sister and all those affected by this mass incarceration system.
Thank you so much, Cairo. I really appreciate it.